We continue now at the top of Daf Tesam Beis and Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 9b. On the previous summit, the Gemara said that if a person is riding an animal in the city, that would not be a good kinyan. And the Gemara asked, why is that the case? And the Gemara explained that the Baraisa is talking about a situation where a person was actually buying the animal, and the seller said you have to acquire it in the normal fashion, and it's not normal to ride an animal in the city. That wasn't considered to be modest. And the Gemara now continues with exceptions to this rule. V'ir Rishus Harabim, who now if he happens to be in a Rishus Harabim, so then kani, that it is an acquisition. Rashi explains, V'ir Rishus Harabim kani, be'ir, meaning to say, let's say in the city, he's in a Rishus Harabim, the derech lirchov sham. In the Rishus Harabim of the city, it actually is normal to ride the animal. V'lo lahanig, it's actually more normal to ride the animal than to lead the animal. Pen yifsaku over derachim beino levein behemto, because maybe the people in the road would get between him and his animal. That's why it's better to ride the animal in the Rishus Harabim, so that would be an exception within the city where riding is a kinyan in this case. And another exception, vi adam chashavu, let's say he's an important person, so kani then also would be an acquisition. And Rashi explains, vi adam chashavu, if he's an important person, ein darko lahanig behema baraglav, it's not normal to lead an animal with his feet, v'derech kavod lirchov aleh, it's actually more respectable to ride on it, af besimta she'ein b'nei adam sham, even if you're in not a full-fledged Rishus Harabim, an area where there are not a lot of people. V'chein isha, and likewise with a woman, as the Gemara is about to say, she'ein ba koach lechos ha-behema pentinote keimena, she doesn't have the strength to grab the animal and might get away from her, so it's normal to ride. As the Gemara says, v'isha hi kanya, again, if it's a woman we're talking about, then that's also a kinyan. And finally, v'inish azila, who if he's a detestable person, kani, so then it's also an acquisition, as Rashi says, v'inish azila, who kanish adarko lirchov lifnei kol, because somebody like that, he'll ride around on an animal in front of everyone. He doesn't care about tznius, he doesn't care about modesty. Af below dochig lefi she'ein tzanui, he's not a modest person, so that's going to be a normal thing for him to do as well. That's a kinyan. And Rashi says, Adam Beinoni, let's say it's an average person. He's not very wealthy. He's not embarrassed to do it, to walk an animal with his feet. So ein darko lircho besimta be'ir. So then it's not normal for such a person to ride around in an area that's not a Rishus Harabim in the city, mishum tznius, because of modesty. And again, that's the case we were talking about in the Brisa. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rebbe Lazar asks the following question, Omer lechaveru, if somebody says to his friend, Mishoch behemazu, pull this animal, liknos kelim she'elah, in order to acquire the vessels that are upon the animal, mahu, what's the halacha? And Rashi explains, Mishoch behemazu al manas liknos kelim she'elah, b'mekach u'memkar, we're talking here specifically about a sale, u'mocher lo asa kelim v'lo asa behema. The point is, he's selling him the vessels, but he's not selling to him the animal. And the Gemara clarifies the question, liknos, the way it was phrased was, he says to his friend, Mishoch behemazu, pull this animal, liknos, in order to acquire. But mi amar lekani, but did he tell him acquire? Did he say the word kani, meaning is the seller really being makne, the kalim, to the buyer? And so the Gemara says, yeah, that's exactly the question. Ella, rather, it should be phrased as follows, Mishoch behemazu, pull this animal, ukani, and thereby acquire kalim she'elah, the vessels that are upon it. You wouldn't use the language of liknos if you were the seller, you would use the language of ukani. And so again, the question is, what's the halacha? Does the pulling of the animal help to acquire the kalim, or not? Is it going to be a kinyan on the kalim or not? And Rashi explains, liknos mi ka'amar le'kani. Again, he's using the word liknos, but did he say kani? Liknos mashma, the word liknos sounds like it's saying, atoy eskavin liknos, you acquire, but ani eini maknalach, but I'm not giving it over to you. And again, that's why the Gemara revises it, that he does say kani. And the Gemara continues and answers on my Rava says, Yamar le'kni behemu kni kalim. Let's say the case would have been, he tells him to acquire the animal and to acquire the vessels. Mi kani kalim, do you think in that situation he would acquire the vessels? He would not. Chatzer ma'alechasi, it's a walking chatzer. The chatzer ma'alechas lo kana, and a chatzer that is walking is not able to be kona, and so therefore, of course, he's not able to acquire the vessels in this case. V'chitayim, and if you're going to say kisha'amda, that we're talking about a case where the animal is standing and not walking, but that doesn't make a difference. V'kol she'ilu mahalech lo kana. If you have a situation where if it would be walking, it's not a kinyan, so if it's standing and sitting, it's also not a kinyan. And the Gemara concludes, v'hilchasa b'chafo, so the halach is, we're talking about a situation where it is bound. And Rashi explains, mikani kalim, would he acquire the vessels even in a situation where the person is being makne both the behema and the kalim, meaning the b'meshicha the behema imha behema, let's say he's pulling the animals together with the animals, would he also acquire the vessels? It's not true. From the fact that the question originally was being asked, where the vessels are being sold without the animal, that sounds like it implies that if both were being sold, it's obvious that it would be a good kinyan. Because he's acquiring the animal, he certainly would acquire the vessels as well. That's what it sounded like, but that's not true. Mishum Torah's chatzar, it sounds like that would work as a chatzar. The kaimelon chatzar shel adam konelo, because there's halacha, the courtyard of a person could acquire things for him. Uvehemto kechatzeiro, and you're saying the animal is like a chatzar. V'hachatzar mahalechasi, but again, that's not true. Even in a situation where he's being makned the behema and the kalim, he would get the behema, but he would not get the kalim because of the fact that it's a chatzar mahaleches. V'chatzar mahaleches lo shaminan detikni, when you have a walking chatzar that's not able to acquire. Tachis rabboi meim himotze timotze biyado gago chatzer v'karfifo. It's rabbi delo nayid v'havim mishtaber. We're only including from the drasha a chatzar which is not moving, which is considered mishtamer. We learn out the concept of a kinyan chatzar from him himotze timotze biyado. So we learn out his roof and his chatzar and his karfif, which is an enclosed area. They can be kona, but again, it can't be moving around. It has to be mishtamer. V'chiteima keshamdan. If you're going to try to answer, we're talking where the animal is standing still. Liachar she'akra yod v'ragel of niknes lo habehema b'meshicha, meaning after the animal moved a little, because you have to acquire the animal with a meshicha by pulling it, amda then stands still. V'lo halcha doesn't walk. V'niknu kelim b'amidasa, then he'll acquire the vessels when it's standing. The kana lo chatzer, that'll be a kinyan chatzer, but that's not going to work either, because kol shila mahalech lo kana k'lamar kaven deruuya hilelech, meaning since it could in theory walk, lav dumya the chatzeri, it's not similar to a courtyard. Ve'in konim b'toras chatzer, it cannot acquire as a chatzer. And finally, the Gemara concluded v'hilchasa haydeb shitale the chiyamar le kni behemo kni kelim kani, meaning in a situation it sounded like it was obvious to the one asking the question that if he said acquire the behema and the vessels, then he would acquire it. That's only b'chafosa. That's only if it's bound, meaning b'chafosa hideb shitale. If it's bound, then it actually is obvious. The dumya the chatzer kani, because that's already similar to a chatzer, and it would create an acquisition. V'chol heicha da'amrina b'gemara v'amar Rava kol shila mahalech lo kani. And Rashi also points out, anytime you see anywhere in the Gemara where it says that Rava said that if it's walking, it's not a kinyan, so it's standing also, mehacha ka'amrile, this is actually the source for that statement of Rava. And in any case, the Gemara continues, Amru le Rapapa v'Rav Huna b'reid Rav Yoshua l'Rava. So Rapapa and Rav Huna b'reid Rav Yoshua, they responded to Rava's argument, Ela me'ata, but according to that, haya mahalich b'sfina, let's say a person is walking in a boat, v'kafsu dogim, and fish jump v'naflu l'soch hasfina, and they fall inside the boat. Hachanami the chatzar mahalechasi v'lo kani, are you going to say over there also, because Rava's entire argument over here is that chatzar mahalechas is not able to be kona, are you going to say over here as well that chatzar mahalechas is not kona? Amar lei, so he said back to him, Sfina meinach naicha, when it comes to a boat, that actually is considered at rest. Umayahudu kamamti lo, it's actually the water which is moving. Amar le Ravina le Ravashi, so Ravina said to Ravashi, Elameata, but according to that, Haisam halechas b'rshas harabim, if she's walking, a woman is walking in rshas harabim, v'zarak laget l'soch cheika l'soch kalson, let's say he throws to her get, and it goes in her lap, or it goes in her basket, hachanami de lo migrasha, there also you're going to say it's not a divorce. Amar lei said to him, Kalsa meinach naicha, again, the basket is considered to be at rest, v'ihi to kamaske mitusa, and she's the one that is walking underneath it. And Rashi explains, Kalsa is the sal shal rosha, that's the basket on her head, shenosenes ba klei melachta v'tovishula, that's where she puts her various utensils. Hachanami de lo have a gita, you think that's not a get? V'anon tanan, but we learned in the Mishnah, the Meseches gitin and Meseches gitin, zarak la gita l'soch cheika l'soch kalsa, it says explicitly, if he threw her get into her lap or into her basket, hareza mugreshes, it is in fact a divorce. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Hayerochiv al gavi behema, if a person is riding on an animal, v'roas hametzia, and he sees a lost object, v'yamar lechaveru, he says to his friend, Tino li, give it to me, not to love v'yamar, and then the person takes it and says, Ani zochi siba, I'm the one that is going to be the owner of it, zochaba, so the person who picked it up, he is zoche. Im mishanosna lo, now if, however, after he gives it to the person on the animal, Amar, then he says, Ani zochi siba, tchila, I had in mind to acquire it at first, lo amar klum, so that is nothing. And Rashi says, Lo Amar Klum, he hasn't said anything if he makes that statement again after he already gave it to the person. Even if we say that when a person picks up something for his friend, it is not a kinyan for his friend, but but once he gives it to him, it's already a kinyan either way. If the first person acquired it, meaning he didn't have intention to give it to his friend, but he just gave it to him as a gift, even if when the person first picked it up, he did not have in mind that the person on the animal should acquire it, but now he gave it to the person on the animal essentially as a matana. Now, if the first person did not acquire it, because he didn't have such an intention, it's ownerless until it came to this person on the animal. And so therefore, that person on the animal, he's going to acquire it because he took it from the first person in order to acquire it. And the Gemara says, Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah over there, Misha Like Desa Peya, if somebody's collecting Peya. V'yamani says, Harezu Leploni Ani, this Peya is for so-and-so who's a poor person. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Zachalo, Rabbi Eliezer says that he acquires it on behalf of that poor person. The Chachamim Omer, but the Chachamim say, Yitnene Lo'ani Hanim Sarishan, he has to give it to the Ani who he finds first. And Rashi explains, Misha Liket Esapeya means Adam Bialma. We're talking about any regular person. She'eno Baal Sada, not the owner of the field. The Iba Baal Sada, because if we're talking about the owner of the field, Lo Amar Rabbi Eliezer Zocha. There Rabbi Eliezer would not say that the poor person is Zocha. Delek Olamemar Migo de Zochi Lenafshe, because you can't say, since he could acquire it for himself, because he's not able to acquire it for himself, if he's the owner of the field. Even if he was poor, he's warned not to collect payah from his own field. Like we say in Shchitas Chulin, we learn it out from the pasuk. In other words, the point over here is it's a different person who, in theory, could acquire for himself, and since he could acquire for himself, Rabbi Eliezer says he can acquire on behalf of a different ani. And the Gemara continues and explains this Mishnah in Meseches Peya. Amar Ula says, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Machlokas may usher la'ani. The machlokas here in this Mishnah is specifically a wealthy person picking it up on behalf of an ani. It's Rabbi Eliezer Savar, because Rabbi Eliezer holds, Migo di iboy mafkir nichse v'havi ani, since in theory, this person could render all of his own property ownerless, and then he can be an ani. V'chazile, and then in theory he could take it for himself. Hashtanami chazile, so now it's considered like it's fit for himself. Umigo de zachi l'nafshe zachi nami. We apply the rule that since he could acquire it for himself, he can acquire it on behalf of his fellow, on behalf of this other ani. But the Rabbanan say, Chad migo amrinan, one migo will say, but Shrei migo lo amrinan, we're not going to say two migos, we won't say a double migo, since he could make everything that he has ownerless to make himself poor, and then migo de zachi l'nafshe, since he can acquire for himself, he can acquire for his fellow, that we don't say a double migo. Avol me'ani lani, but let's say he'd be poor, and he's trying to be zoch on behalf of another poor person, Divrei HaKol Zachalo, everybody would agree, meaning it's not just the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, even the Chachamim would agree that he can acquire it on behalf of this other ani, the Migo de Zachi L'Navshei Zachi Na'im L'Chavri, because since he can in theory acquire it for himself, he can acquire it for his friend. Amar le Rav Nachman le'ula. So Rav Nachman said to Ula, "V'leima mar me ani lani machlokas." But why doesn't the master say instead that the machlokas actually is from a poor person to another poor person? Dava Metzia hakol ani metzla. Because let's say you have something which is found, you have a lost object which is found. Everybody's considered an ani relative to that item. Utnan, and we learned in our Mishnah, hayerochiv al gavi behem. If a person's riding on an animal, v'roas hametzia, and he sees a lost object which he finds, v'amar lechaver, and he says to his friend, "Tanali, give it to me." Not to love amar. So if he takes it and he says that I'm being zoch in it, so zocha ba, so then he acquires it. So iyamrit b'shlom. Now, if you would say correctly, me ani lani machlokas, that in a case of from one poor person to another poor person is a machlokas. And Rashi explains, V'lei mamar, let the master say, Da'afilu me'ani lani, that even from one poor person to another, even in that case, Amri Rabbanan de lo zochalo, the Rabbanan say it's not effective, he cannot be zoch on behalf of the ani. Ta'ametzia kol ani metzla, when it comes to a lost object, everyone's considered an ani. Kolomar, what that means to say is, Hakol kshedim lizkos ba, kaniyim bepeya. It just means to say that anyone can take that lost object for himself, just like aniyim are able to take peya. Utanan, and we learned in our Mishnah, Hamagbi metzila chaver lo kona chaver, we say that if somebody picks up a for his friend, it's not an acquisition. We don't say that since he could have taken it for himself, he can take it for his friend. When he picks it all up for his friend, that's not like we learned in our Mishnah. He's riding, etc. Right now, we think it means as follows: I want to be zochen it right now. We think the Mishnah means that originally he did pick it up for his friend, then he changed his mind because Tani Zachaban, it says that he gets it. You see that the original picking up for his friend was nothing, and then when he changed his mind, took it for himself, he's able to take it for himself. And so the Gemara therefore says, if you're going to say that the machlokas is from one ani to another, and the Amri Rabbanan lo Amrin and Migo de Zachi L'Nafshi Zachi Na'im L'Chavri, the point is that the Rabbanan hold we don't say Migo de Zachi L'Nafshi Zachi Na'im L'Chavri. It would only work if he's picking it up for both of them. Kagon Shnayim Sheikbiu Metzia, like for example, two people picking up a lost object together. Damar Boleel Gabe Bizman She Modim Cholkim. We said if they both admit they divide it below Shvua without an oath, the time Mishamigo de Zachi Bagbazul Nafshe. So there already we say, since with this lifting up he's getting it for himself, Zachin Amil Chavri, he can get it also for his friend. But that's a different kind of migo. There he actually is acquiring it for himself and also can acquire it on behalf of his friend. Avol migo di boyav Zachil Nafshe. But to say a migo that he could have taken it for himself, Zachil Chavri, and therefore he can take it for his friend, Lo Amrinon, that we do not say, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Amud Aleph.